I think one of the entries in the Resident Evil franchise that doesn't get mentioned enough is the Resident Evil Outbreak series. And unfortunately, the games got kind of cut short after two entries. But it was an interesting experiment in the PS2 era of gaming that I thought in a lot of ways worked incredibly well. Now, don't get me wrong, there were definitely some deficits and some issues with the way it was formatted, but previous to that, we never had any sort of online Resident Evil experience until the Outbreak games. And I think that those games did a lot of really cool things that I wish got brought back for modern audiences. So in this video, I'm going to go over what some of those things are and overall go over why I believe Resident Evil Outbreak deserves a chance at either a remaster or even better, a remake. So let's take a look. When Resident Evil Outbreak came out, it was released amongst already some of the strongest Resident Evil titles, like the Resident Evil Remake. I believe Zero was already released. We already had Code Veronica X, and Resident Evil 4 was on the horizon. So Outbreak was unique in that, like all those different games that did some really cool things or really built upon some of the previous Resident Evil games, Outbreak took a lot of those games' elements but took it online. And at that time period for the PS2, it was becoming more of a novelty that was added to a lot of games that we had some sort of online play, but it was something that took off immensely and really helped define that era of gaming. And I was fortunate enough to be one of those gamers who was able to play my PS2 online and experience great games like Resident Evil Outbreak. Now, at that time period, the way it was structured, because you have to understand what Capcom had done was they were trying to convert that Resident Evil experience that people typically dealt with on their own, but bring it online to share with others. And what was unique about it was Capcom realized that you probably weren't going to play front to back like the Resident Evil Remake, and it would make more sense to have scenarios that you would go through with friends so you could hop in, play for an hour, 2 hours, and then get out and go on about your day or night. And I thought that format at that time period worked incredibly well. You were able to get that Resident Evil experience in short bursts, but each of the scenarios felt, in my opinion, well crafted, and a lot of them were based off of the initial outbreak of Resident Evil. So in some areas, you start off in a diner and kind of go through that experience of the outbreak, or you're at a zoo and you're seeing how the T-virus has affected some of the animals and you have to deal with those enemies in those territories. And I thought that worked incredibly well, and it really helped round out at that time period the Resident Evil universe. And I really appreciated how you started, or each character that you picked also had different attributes, and it really pushed you to engage in proper co-op play online. Now at that time period, and I believe this was a design choice from Capcom, they didn't actually allow you to do voice chat, which was a mixed thing on consoles at that time period, but it was becoming more and more commonplace. And I believe the reason for that was Capcom didn't want, maybe a bunch of 10-year-old kids screaming into a microphone and ruining the suspense of playing a survival horror game with friends. So you ended up having this janky system where you had predefined things you could say, which made it a little difficult to navigate through some of the more complicated puzzles or areas in Outbreak. But this is where I think this game would really benefit from a proper remaster. And when I say remaster, I'm talking something like re-releasing it on modern consoles with HD graphics and allowing you the ability to have group chat. Because you have to understand, at that time period when the game came out, it wasn't common to have party chats unless the game was programmed for the ground up to include it, whereas on modern consoles, party chats are built into all of the online infrastructure, so no matter what game you're playing, you have the ability to do private party chats, which would heavily round out a survival horror title like Outbreak. Even better, however, would be having an Outbreak style game, or Outbreak itself, remade using the great Resident Evil engine like they've done for Resident Evil 2, 3, and 4. And I think that at this time period, you'd see a lot of people jump into that type of title, and I think that there were a lot of fantastic scenarios in that game that would capitalize being remade in these engines. And Resident Evil Outbreak 1 and File 2 were very vast in what they offered as far as I was concerned, as far as variability in areas, and I thought it was a fantastic approach to the Resident Evil universe, being able to see the outbreak from all these different scenarios and characters in a way that other Resident Evil games didn't really do. And to be transparent, I thought at this time period, I found a lot of the stories or the sub-stories that were in this and the areas in this a lot more interesting than Resident Evil 0 even. So, in my opinion, I think at this time period, we're due for, at bare minimum, even a remaster or a re-release with it in HD like we saw with Code Veronica X, as opposed to not having it at all, because I feel like Resident Evil Outbreak, unfortunately, has been kind of thrown to the wayside. And even if Capcom wanted to keep it simple and just capitalize on releasing it as is with, you know, a 4K resolution, I can't see why you wouldn't have a large player base who'd still want to re-explore what was, in one of my opinions, one of the more underrated survival horror titles from Capcom.